The Empire Strikes Back does not end with, well, sorry, Luke and Leia, you failed that fight against Vader, so you guys are dead now and Hannah's trapped forever. Roll up new characters. Series is over.
That's Joe Abercrombie. That's grimdark.
Welcome to the Encounter Table, where we discuss game design, dive deep into how to make your encounters interesting, and build encounters for you to use at your table. I'm your host, Ryan.
I'm Ralf.
And I'm Kade.
Today, we're going to talk about how thinking about the stakes, or really failure, can be used to make your encounters more interesting. So this is another topic I wrote about on the site. I wrote a longer piece on it. One issue whenever you're running a role-playing game is that it is a game. Part of a game is success and failure. One of the things that I had to start really considering about encounters is when I designed encounters, I would design a cool encounter that I thought was a lot of fun and difficult, and then my PCs would almost die and I would fudge a roll so that they lived or just make it succeed. So one of the things that I really wanted to start considering was, how do we plan for failure and how do we think about what it means for the PCs to fail, and how can we have failure with the story continuing to move forward? You guys want to talk a little bit about some of your experience with failure in a role-playing game?
Sure. Failure is, it's an old friend. Particularly as a player, not as a GM, of course, but as a player, I tend to have really poor luck, so I roll quite poorly a lot of times. I think the main goal of this conversation is not description of the time that I failed, the biggest, most important thing, and it just derailed the whole thing. I don't think that's the point. I think the point is those times when failure was still fun for a player. I think that matters to me a lot. Something that I can think of just off the top of my head. It wasn't fighting. It was more like research or investigation or anything like that. I kept failing these roles, and luckily it was a group where that did not derail the game. That did not stop the action. There were other people that could do other things to find the same information, but it was just that kind of thing was disheartening as the player. I'm just like, I can't do the thing that I want to do. But I think that is there's a balance. There's got to be a balance where it's fun. If there's no stakes, then there's nothing that's going to drive the action forward either.
Exactly. When I think about failures I had in personal games, sure, we all fail roles that somebody else can do the same or a similar test. But when there were some failures in there that were important for the story, I found they made the story even better. In many times, I can't think of a single example where a failure came from a role right now, but I can think of many times where my character would do something that was just in character that would lead to a situation we could call a failure overall in the story. And that would add some flavor to the story. And I think that's part of why it is so fun. If we don't fail a roll, there's no need to roll. If we don't do anything that we know as a player might not be the smartest choice, but our character would do that, hell, give me a button, I press that. It's basically that. And I had some amazing stuff going on with that mentality in many games. So yeah, there were some failures in there, some failures that I kind of foreseen. but they made the story fun. So I do like failures.
I think failure is super important in games for a few different reasons. One is it's a game. To me, if I walk into a game knowing that I'm going to win, I have a far less enjoyable experience. Not just a role-playing game, any game. I don't want to walk into a game knowing that I'm going to win. That defeats the purpose for me. And I know that's more on a player level, but then also within a storytelling level. Characters who never fail are just not very interesting. At least in my opinion. You may feel differently, but I do think they're not very interesting. And if internet advice is to be believed, there seems to be two sort of polar opposite ends of the GMing experience. One is the GM who is the cheering on their players and always wants them to fail forward and wants it to be a happy, fun time. And the other one is the adversarial GM who is finding every way that they can to trick their players and to make sure that they won't succeed, and to make it hard for them. And I think the most fun lies somewhere in the middle. I'm not
I would agree
being a
with that.
GM to beat my players, but also they should really be able to fail. And I think one of the big things that really opened my mind up about this and got me thinking about it a lot was an article by the Angry GM, who I know is a bit of a decisive figure in the community. But one of the things that he said, he's writing an article about, failure and rolling and all of that, is that whenever you ask a player to roll the dice, there should be a fail and a success. And if you know, or the story requires something to fail or something to succeed, then why are you asking them to roll? Really, the steps in most role-playing games, I'm sure there are exceptions, is you with a DM or a GM, is you describe to the GM or DM what it is that you want to do. The DM or GM will tell you, hey, this is what you need to roll to do it. Or the other option we have is the DM or GM is to just say that it happens or it does not happen. And both of those are completely okay as long as they fit in with the tone of the group, your session 0 stuff, and the narrative of the story. And then based on what you decide, either it will happen, it won't happen, or there is some possibility of it happening, then you decide, how difficult would it be? I need to set a dice roll. And then what happens if it will happen, or what happens if it doesn't happen? Because really, the worst thing to do, and I think I'm definitely guilty of this, I imagine every DM is guilty of this, is you put a locked door in a dungeon. And the players have to get through that door. They have to pick that lock. And so what do? Everybody takes turns rolling the dice, picking the lock until you make it through. Why did we do that? Now, it might not be a locked door. It could be climbing a wall. It could be getting down through something. And the question really becomes, if we knew everybody needed to do that to succeed, and they could do it to succeed given enough time, and if nothing interesting happens if they fail, then why did you roll dice? What purpose did that serve in the gameplay and in the story of the narrative? So I think that's just an important thing to start considering in general when you talk about checks and anything else. But when you have an encounter, there's no chance of failure or no possible loss of succeeding, then why does the encounter exist? If nothing can happen, right? Then why have it in the first place?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think in the example that you said, let's go with climbing the wall. Even if it's something that has to happen, and I know the players will get up, and this is just something I would be doing, I would have them roll. At least in a system where we have something like a critical success or a critical failure or botches or something like that. Based on the role, how well the group rolls or how unwell they roll, I would adjust the timeline, how much time it takes. So the failure outcome would be you make it up there just slow. That would be just some adjustments I would do narratively. What I would be looking for is if there is something critical in there that would have a bigger influence, then maybe they lose part of their equipment. If I run a game where we actually do track equipment, not necessarily my style of game, but if we do a dungeon crawl and we say, hey, we count arrows, we count rations and stuff like that, you lost your backpack. That is a big setback. Nobody died, but it's a huge setback just because one player rolled a 1 or something like that. So I think you can use those rolls for something good rather than just, oh yeah, you don't make it up there, which is super boring.
But yeah, and like you were saying, any system, which is a lot of systems, most systems that have that above standard success or a below standard failure, this idea of a critical, there should be an impact. I mean, I'm going to talk to the NPC and that's when I roll a 20, as opposed to when I need to climb the wall and I roll, a 1. But like that, it has to be rewarded and I mean, the opposite of that word is punish, but I don't like that. But there has to be a consequence for the failure, and there has to be a reward for the success. If you're on this continuum of where at one end, there's what they call the critical, and on the other end there's the critical failure. So I think that is the player is going to feel disappointed when they're climbing the wall and they roll a 1 and they're like, oh, well, you just have to climb it again because we need you to get to the top of the wall. That's stupid. That's like, yeah, okay. Yeah. And that goes back to what you originally said, Ryan, of like, why did you create this obstacle? What's the purpose? Yeah.
Exactly. And I'm 100% guilty of doing that exact thing. There's a wall. Roll to get up it. Oh, you didn't roll to get up it. Roll up again. Does it matter that you didn't get up it the first 4 times? No, but now you're up. Oh, I took 3 HP away from you before a long rest. Whoop-de-doo. So I think it's just, knowing what it is. And there's a couple of concepts I want to talk about that get more internet advice that gets floated around with. And I think I'm going to say something a little controversial here. 140 characters is not a way to have a real discussion or a real thought about anything. As much as I enjoy spending a bit of time on Twitter, often little pieces of advice get floated around and then lose all meaning very quickly. If you want to see anything, the discussion of railroading versus sandbox games, which now both of those terms mean nothing. But one that I see a lot is, just make your PCs fail forward. I am not opposed to the idea of failing forward. I think the central concept of failing forward is a very cool idea. It's like, how do we, or at least in what I took from its origin, how do we make sure that a failure does not end a campaign? They lost to the big bad evil guy, but none of us really feel satisfied with this ending. I mean, maybe you do, and you just want to end it there, and that's fine, but maybe you don't. How do we move the story forward so that we can keep doing it? How do we make sure that failures allow you to keep moving? Cool. I think that's great. I also think, and I am guilty of struggling with this in my own DMing, I will be 100% transparent about it, but you need to have places where the PCs can fail. Again, victory feels hollow if there is never a real, I think to a certain extent, you break the illusion of, the game or the tension when you get rid of all chance of any failure. And failure does not mean it should not mean that you end the game. It goes back to those things that we talked about. What can you lose? What can you, what thing that you tried to do is now no longer an option? How does this impact your adventure and your story?
What you mentioned about the fail forward thing, is that just a reimagining of how narrative play works versus more, traditional simulation play? Is that where you have the, like you mentioned Twitter, where you have the main fights about that stuff? You have people coming from one thought in more in the narrative camp, and not saying that either one is bad, or I'm not making a judgment about either thing, but I'm saying, is that part of the issue there, where I've played in games, particularly games, quote unquote traditional type systems, Pathfinder, D&D, that kind of stuff, where you die. Okay, here's a new sheet, roll up a new character. That's what it is. Like, it's not and then I've played in other games, particularly more narrative games, where failure is part of storytelling. It's the Malfoy stole Harry Potter's, bag of goodies, and so that's a setback more than a stopping the story. So I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just got me thinking when you said the word fail forward. It immediately got me thinking about that's a different mindset almost for some players and some GMs.
Sure. I don't see many people, I guess when I talk about the argument between failing and failing forward, I don't read much where people are really like arguing about, no, you shouldn't be able to fail forward.
I'll send you those websites.
I'm good. I just see sometimes advice bandied back and forth saying things like, always make sure your players fail forward. Oh, the players were defeated by the big evil bad guy. Have them wake up in the dungeon of his castle. So you've just turned something that was a failure into essentially a success in some ways. Like, oh, now they're not confronting this guy anymore. They know exactly where his hideout is. And again, I'm not here to be like, this is the only way to play and you are not allowed to have fun in any other way and blah, blah, blah. That's not the idea. But the idea is that if actual failure is on the table, I think it creates more tension in a game. And I think I would see in most games, in most stories, it's interesting when bad things happen. Nobody wants them to happen, but it is more interesting, right? When that NPC that you guys have come to know and love is gone now because you failed to save them. When the town is burned down because you were supposed to be at this place and you couldn't do it. When it creates more adversity for your heroes to come back against and hopefully overcome. And I think I want to be really clear in that not always allowing PCs to fail forward is not in opposition to being the biggest fans of your PCs. I do feel like I do a good job of, I don't want my PCs to fail all the time. I do want to see them succeed, but I also want to see them overcome adversity, because that's what you want to see in a story, right? No, yeah. I keep using words like nobody, but for the most part, you don't read a book that's like, oh, I woke up and the guy ate a bowl of cereal and he went to work and he didn't make any mistakes and he went home and like, job well done. Failure needs to be a thing.
And I think for that failure being a thing, we need to, and that's what we talked before, the BBEG needs to have a clear motivation, needs to have a goal on their own, and do something with that failure based on their goal. So they wanted to overrun the city. We failed to hold the gate. They now advance. It's a clear consequence of that failure. This is part of the story. I mean, read or watch any of the big fantasy movies. They don't always win.
Well, I mean, there's a reason that, Empire Strikes Back is the movie that everybody likes. It's not because they win.
It's a good point.
Yeah.
Going back to that same example, The Empire Strikes Back does not end with, well, sorry, Luke and Leia, you failed that fight against Vader, so you guys are dead now and Hannah's trapped forever. Roll up new characters. Series is over, right?
That's Joe Abercrombie. That's grimdark.
So I do think that's one thing that we have to consider is what do the PCs have to lose besides death? I think there are times that is a perfectly appropriate stake that,
A hand was a pretty good consequence.
a hand. Yeah. But what are the things that they could lose that would make the story more interesting? Because if every fight is, well, if we lose, we die. I mean, that gets real old real quick.
But those monsters are just looking to level up.
It's true. In an entirely XP-based world. I mean, that's the game that somebody needs to write right there. A role-playing game in which the world functions like a role-playing game. Everybody is out just murdering each other for XP and gold. Entirely XP and gold-based economy.
Yeah.
Brutal.
I'm sure that book exists somewhere. I'll just have to look for it.
I mean, another thing to think about with what they can lose, is different fail states. It does not need to be binary. It's not, sometimes it will be, right? But it does not need to be either I succeed or I fail. And there is no in between. There's all sorts of different things you can do to create different states of success. In fact, there are some systems like Powered by the Apocalypse, which I know we talked about before, which includes a host of different games that use the same system. Basically, you roll 2d6. I think it's 7 and lower. No, below a 7 is a complete failure. 7 and 9 is what they call partial success, which is they have a success with a cost. Basically, you succeed, but you lose something, or something doesn't go the way you want it to, and then a total success on above. And then they also have critical success as well. But it's a great way of codifying the idea that it's okay to have a success at a cost. It's okay to have a complete failure, right? And it's okay to have a complete success. If you will go back to our same example, pretty sure Han had a complete failure. He got at the end of Empire Strikes Back. He was frozen.
That's a critical.
Things were not looking great for him. He rolled, I think, under a 6 there, right? He's now stuck. There's nothing he's going to be able to do to move it forward. Luke, that's probably a partial success. He got away from Darth Vader, but he lost a hand. But Star Wars examples aside, that is a really interesting thing that you could do in any RPG. Like, okay, maybe we do lose the town, but we managed to save most of the people. Maybe we do or the opposite. Maybe we drive the threat back. We managed to save off the threat. We still have the town, but in doing so, we lost, a lot of people in the town. Or maybe we did neither. But having those different, I think, levels of success can also make an encounter or an adventure more interesting.
Yeah. Rolf and I, speaking of Powered by the Apocalypse adjacent, Rolf and I were in a one-shot of Scum and Villainy the other day, which is a Blades in the Dark in space, basically. And it took me a minute to get my head around it, but I really like that system of the failure means that there is, because the GM doesn't really roll in that system. So the failure means that the bad guys did something, which was kind of a different way of handling those successes. And then the way that system works, the middle range, the partial success, it could be what they called in that game. They called the effect. So your partial success, maybe you didn't do exactly what you wanted to do, but it wasn't a completely negative result. But it was a different way of handling those, success, partial success, and failure kind of thing.
Yeah. And then we have systems that are completely based with failing but consequences. When we look, for example, at the Genesis system, where we roll colorful dice with wonderful symbols and need a little cheat sheet to figure out, because we're not playing it every week, so we always forget what the symbols mean. But you can succeed something and still something bad happens, which is great. And I love that a lot about this system. There it is a little bit more mechanically introduced, which I also think is an interesting way to see that. And but the system is set up with the idea, just because you succeed doesn't mean everything is good, or just because you failed doesn't mean everything is bad. And I really like that.
I will tail on that. To me, in my experience, Genesis is the game that has most encouraged role-playing and has helped myself and players get better at role-playing, because the way the system is set up, I highly recommend playing it, or the Star Wars, the Fantasy Flight Star Wars games, which are Genesis, or the kind of origin of Genesis. It encourages you to really think more about your character as a character, I would say, than any other game that I've played, in a way that is enforced mechanically. I'm not saying there aren't other games that, don't get you to dive deeply in character, but when you roll, talking about Genesis, right? You roll a pool of dice, you don't have numbers, you have symbols, which represent successes and failures, which are in opposition to each other. You also have threats and advantages, which are in opposition to each other, which are like added little bonuses, and then triumphs and despairs, which are in opposition to each other, which are like critical success, critical fail. If you want a really good example, people who really know how this system works and they're super entertaining, I highly suggest listening to the Campaign podcast by One Shot Network. They do a really excellent job. They're part of the reason I fell in love with the system. But I do think for me, it has always encouraged my players and myself to think way more about the narrative, because when you roll the dice, you with the players interpret the narrative. It's no longer I'm trying to win or I'm trying to lose or did I get the success. There's a lot more of like, what does this die roll mean for our story? And I think some of the most fascinating storytelling and just most fun that I've had, it ends up being a little silly often with the group of people who I play it with, but it is still super fun because you end up with these wild things that happen where somebody succeeds, but they have 5 threats. So like, how did you do an excellent job, but now you're totally, because of that great job that you did, you're totally in a bad position. And then everybody's thinking more in terms of the story. And like, because it's so much fun, I think, to fail in that game or to have weird things happen in that game, I find that the players take way more risks than they would in something like D&D, where it is really set up to optimize and make you want to succeed. Because if you don't succeed, you fail and the narrative stops, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. I also think, and this is not something that's in the book as far as I know, I think that's something you do very well when you run the Star Wars or the Genesis game, is that when there are despairs or what's the other one?
Triumphs.
No, not as bad as the despairs.
Threat.
Threats, yeah.
Threats. So when there are threats on the table, you're not telling what it is, you're asking, and you're not just asking the player who rolled, you ask the group. And I think that's something that brings the role-playing more into it. And I think that also helps with the engagement of all the people when somebody rolls, because they get to drop in ideas as well when something happens with a threat or with an advantage or something like that. I think that's something mechanical that you can use very well at a table to foster that group element of role playing, and I really like that.
Yeah, and it's great at giving us multiple fail states, which then, I think those kinds of things are a little bit harder to do in other systems that are more binary, but you can still use that same type of thinking, Man, the DC was 15 and my players rolled a 14. What does this almost success look like? And it's okay to give them a choice too. Like, it's okay to say to your players, if you wanted to do something like this, you can say, you can either fail or you can succeed, but you're going to lose something. You're going to succeed at a cost. What is it that you lose? Those things that you lose, that can be some of the most interesting parts of storytelling. I am running a D&D game right now where through a series of events, my PCs ended up in the Feywild, right? And one of them ended up with a terrible curse, and they had met some sort of godlike being along the way. And she had offered them different things depending on, she'd offered them anything that she wanted, but she wanted like I set up this scene where she met them that she wanted a part of their destiny in order to help them. So they ended up giving up two of the PCs, a wizard and a bard, ended up giving up very important items to them, which signified a relationship between, so let me back up to kind of make it clear. One of the PCs ended up with a terrible curse. They were slowly turning into some kind of like watery monster because they grabbed a cursed item that I think was clearly cursed, but they decided to use it. And they found this person who could help them get rid of the curse, but they wanted to get rid of they wanted them to give up something important to them. Throughout the entire thread of the game, the wizard PC had this great relationship with his mentor. So he decided that he's going to, give up his hat which is the hat from his mentor, which is like a symbol of their relationship. The fracture in that relationship because of that action, because of another PC's failure, right, has been some of the most fascinating part of the entire story, because they're growing apart because of this whole concept of he gave away a piece of his destiny, which was his relationship with his mentor. Although I might be totally off base with what we were originally talking about, but it is that failing, I guess, to hold the things that they want. I think those types of things where you end up having PCs lose something important can be just as interesting, not just as interesting, can be far more fascinating than when they just succeed at everything.
And it shows that something like a cursed item could be basically a mechanic to say, hey, you have something that looks useful, but we have a failure basically baked into it. A weapon that makes your attack better, but you become bloodthirsty. So there's a failure in there, but you get something out of it. So most murder hobos will say, I take that deal. It's something interesting to play with.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm a big fan of the cursed item.
Yeah, and it was all based on choices that they had made, right? Like it wasn't just randomly a cursed item falls into your hand. So one of the things I originally wrote in the article was the idea of what are the other things that the PCs could lose besides death. I called them mechanical repercussions of failure, but I use mechanical in air quotes because some of these things are very story based. They're not number based. They're not, I lose my +1 or I lose they're temporary or fading. But I think these are just some things you could start thinking about what they could lose besides just losing their life or, not being able to move forward. So the things I originally identified, and then I think you guys should chime in with some others that you could think of or some interesting ways, were advantage for the enemy. Like now the enemy has some advantage over you, whether that's information or positional or something like that. And then the opposite, a disadvantaged position. Your failure could be, well, now I'm in a worse situation, as opposed to just having, your enemy have advantage over you. Losing someone or something, a negative reputation. I think this is often an undervalued one. And resource loss. Nothing in my experience curbs murder hoboism like having the world respond to it.
Yes. And that's fun,
when
though.
Nobody wants to trade with you or talk with you because 3 towns over they've heard about you and how you deal with people, then you're not really going to have that issue.
I mean, I think that some sort of reputation mechanic would make a lot of games go a lot farther. But yeah, this list is very good. I was trying to think if I could think of anything to add to that. You could also do, like a lot of games do, some sort of emotional baggage, for lack of a better term. So, what does it mean? Because I know I can't remember the game off the top of my head. But it has, once you reach a certain level of failure, you have physical manifestations of your failure, because it's a like a psychosomatic reaction kind of thing.
One more thing, and this is probably the least structured. The players could have the option to, for the lack of a better word, have some sort of quirk added to their role play. It would not be necessarily something mechanical that involves rolling or advantages or disadvantages on rolls, but it could be something that they play out. Example, and I'm sorry for everyone who has arachnophobia. If you fight against a giant spider, you fail. You could be afraid of spiders. You could even say every time you encounter a spider, you have to roll. I think in D&D it's a will check, or you have the feared condition. That could be even something where you could tie in a mechanic onto it, but it could be something where you say, no, this is something that you could choose. You could give the option to a player if they want to play out something like that. And it doesn't always have to be something that you actually can use a mechanic with the example of fear, but it could be something else that they, I don't know, have some mannerism attached to them that might make interactions with NPCs later on interesting in a different way. So that might be something that could result from a certain failure that has interesting implications for role-playing.
I think the trickiest part about that one is just that you would have to come to that agreement, I guess, more with the player than with, let's say, something happens and the result of the failure. It could be like a magical thing, right? And your PC is has a really hard time keeping secrets, for example. That could be super fun, but only if the person who's taking that on also enjoys that idea and is willing to have fun with it. Because otherwise, it'll end up being a little bit more, either it won't come up or it won't be all that interesting. And this kind of attaches on to something else. An interesting take I've heard on the hindrance and like a hindrance system. Savage Worlds has this. This is basically in a game when you create a character, you create one of the things you do is usually get some type of character creation points, and you can take an added hindrance, which is supposed to be a negative trait, and then that will give you more points to make your character stronger. Often, many of these hindrances, many of them will just be like a mechanical penalty, like you have this or you have that, but like some of them will be like you have a secret enemy or you have an enemy who is against you, and it's like, so I'm going to take this hindrance, which means I'm going to get more spotlight time, and the story is going to have to include more of me, and my character gets better. That's what you're telling me. How do I really lose in this situation? Where is it that I lose in this situation?
But as a GM, that should be
for sure.
That should be a gift. I mean, yeah, that character gets more spotlight, but I mean,
totally.
Now there's a secret enemy. Oh, hell yeah!
In this case, I'm thinking in terms of other players, right? Not necessarily just as the GM. Yeah, no. Don't get me wrong. There's nothing wrong with the secret enemy. That stuff is awesome. I agree. One thing I like to do, and this is another aside, is to differentiate between character knowledge and player knowledge. Not a huge fan of keeping secrets from the players, just because that can get weird or feel batty or whatever. But, playing with people who are usually who are competent enough to be like, I can separate what my character knows and what I know, then we can all join in that same fun, right? And the example I gave you earlier where somebody was slowly being turned into he had this cursed item. It was from a kraken, and it was slowly making him into a fish person. And he was having these like wicked dreams of becoming a fish person and getting called by the kraken and all this stuff. Now, I made it clear to the other players, like, your characters don't know this, but then all of the players got to know it, and they got to watch him react to what he did, like trying to keep it a secret or not saying anything. And then even though it was obnoxious to the other players in some cases, we all got to join in the fun, as opposed to, I roll a die, I whisper to him and nobody else sees, and he makes a little look and everybody else at the table is like, oh, what's going on over there? We all got to enjoy in the fun of the secret, even though we all knew,
I'm still looking for the downside of turning into a fish, though. Sounds pretty awesome.
Slave of a kraken, probably not. Your priorities doesn't really align in the same way. Yeah, it's
oh, well, there you go. It
was mostly a land-based sort of thing, too, campaign. So it could become problematic.
Yeah. All right. I see what you're getting at.
What I also noticed with those hindrance systems is that often players start with min-max mentality, looking at those lists and say, oh, I'm never going to have to use that, so I take that hindrance because it doesn't make a difference at all to our game, and I still get those extra points. Whereas I try to use something that will make a difference. I'm not sure in which system it is, but there is a hindrance that you are an outsider. And every conversation that you will be having will make everything harder. And this is one of my favorite things because it screws me over big time. But again, this is what makes it interesting. That's why, again, it's like a failure that I know it's not going to make it easy for me, but I know I will get some good time out of it playing because it is not easy, and that's why it's fun.
Well, and we like those scenes, right? There are so many movies and television shows where somebody has the right answer and people won't listen to them, and we watch them struggle with that. That's interesting. And not that we don't enjoy those things where it is just all about, where it's, for lack of a better term, competence porn, like where you know, just watch somebody kicking ass. Taken. It's the one with Keanu Reeves. Same idea. John Wick. Right?
Yeah.
Those are fun in terms of, I mean, I guess fun's not the right word for it, but fun in the term of watching somebody who's just really good at something do it again and again and again. But even in those, there's failure scenes, there's low points, there's things that happen, adversity that the character has struggled, because that's why we like a story. And so it just comes back to that main point of you need to have a plan for what happens when your characters fail, and the situation should be set up so that they can fail. That might be partially because of bad decisions. It might be the luck of the dice. It might be not having enough information. But I think you need to allow them to fail, and there needs to be interesting when it happens. Anything else to add before we kind of get into our encounter?
6 people all trying to pick one lock is not interesting.
Yeah. Again and again and again? No, not at all. Again, nobody reads the book about 6 people standing around a door trying to pick a lock.
30 pages of, oh, I broke my lock pick. What do we do now?
I broke my lock pick. What do I? And again, it's not that those things can't be interesting. If they do have a limited amount of resources and it means they now lose something, then that's great. I think I've said this before, but I'll say it again. I've really gone to getting into the whole map-based hex crawl thing when I'm using D&D.
Yeah.
And it just makes the system sing so much more, because that's what it's designed to do. You stick a time limit, you got 30 days to get this done, or you fail, and then now all of a sudden all your resources, how much you bring with you, all of those things that we ignore because they're not interesting to the story, they become part of the story, because you're like, well, what do I do? How much do I carry? Where do I go? When do I retreat? When do I run back for safety? Now, not everybody wants that kind of a story. That's not always the most fascinating kind of story, but I think it can be used to, all those rules that we often think about ignoring can be used to great effect when they're paired with those kinds of things. Because there's opportunity for failure. You might not do the thing you needed to do in time, and now there's going to be big consequences for it.
I mean, the time factor is a really good way to add those extra complications when there is a failure, to just simply say you don't have enough time to do what you want to do, or time's running out because the police, orcs, etc. are coming to get you.
So for our encounter today, we decided to do something explicitly non-D&D, and we found a list of 11 cyberpunk adventure seeds. What we're going to do is we're going to look at the adventure seed. We're going to decide on an encounter, and then we'll talk about what will happen if they fail, what would partial success look like, and what would full success look like, and then kind of maybe not go into the normal depth that we do with each of the bits. What are the goals? What are the modes? What are the stakes for those encounters? But talk about what the next encounter might be for each of those states, if that makes sense. So who wants to roll a D11?
A D11. You roll.
You've got one of those sitting around,
roll
right?
A D12 minus 1.
Definitely.
You could roll a D12 minus, but then there's a 0.
Oh, there's no 0 on your.
Nope. There's 1 through 11.
9.
9. Perfect. All right. 9. Lucky winner. The characters are driving somewhere, best if they're in a hurry to get somewhere, when a hover truck goes screaming by, literally, and the guy doing the screaming jumps off the back of the rig and hooks himself onto the PC's ride. He has one arm that's totally techwear, fitted with some kind of street dock custom winch attachment that keeps him from being shaken off. Make the guy really irritating. He's dressed in nothing but bright neon yellow leather pants with a pink mohawk and a giant laughing skull tattooed. Subdermal LEDs across his chest. He should have some kind of small gun that's really noisy and really good at blowing holes through things without a lot of extra damage, like a high-powered handheld rail gun. But he's a lousy shot. So why is he hopping onto the PC's ride? Well, that's up to you. He picked you up. He picked the ride at random during his escape from anything from the cops, who might be interested in the PCs too, to some vicious and well-armed gang. And if he's shooting, you can bet they're shooting back, putting the PCs in that crossfire.
Yes. A whole lot of potential failure there.
Yeah. So I think we already have a lot of stuff here. What do we think? So essentially, you have an unwanted straggler on the car. So what do we think the encounter is? Which of those things do we really want to pick? What thread do we want to pick up on? Let's decide on who are the NPCs involved in this. I think the guy is pretty well fleshed out. He's an obnoxious guy running away from something. But I think if we talk about what it is he's running away from, that can give us a lot of idea.
I think the idea that whoever or whatever catches up with that guy, there's also consequences for us, is interesting, because otherwise we could just wait till the police comes and picks that guy up and we take a reward. Not necessarily very exciting, but if we are also on the run from the authorities, then we don't want that additional guy making noise getting all the attention to our car.
I mean, that's a great point.
That could be something.
That's a great point. That this is now drawing attention, and perhaps we don't want any attention, particularly as being described as so obnoxious. Yeah.
So the PC's goal in this case is not to get noticed. Doesn't matter who it's by. Police or the gang. Do we think police? Do we think gang? Do we think something else is more interesting chasing after him?
I say we go full Shadowrun. I mean, it's corporate security. It's somebody that's guilt by association. We're going to get shot.
Oh, okay. Yeah, maybe this arm of his, just for our background information, the PCs aren't going to know. Maybe this is new tech that hasn't been really tested. Like he's got a trial grafted onto him and he's busted out. So it's corporate security. Cool. I like that. So then obviously the goal of the goals would be PCs are trying not to get noticed. This guy's trying to get away from corporate security. And he's obviously very bad at it because he's shooting and doing all these things. And corporate security wants that tech back and doesn't want the PCs to know about that tech.
That is important, because otherwise we could just say, hey, we sell it back to them. But if we know the tech exists, we are in trouble as well.
Modes. I think we've already got our 2 modes here, right? We've got, 3. All 3 are here, right? They're negotiating with this guy. They're trying to move, keep this car moving out of harm's way, and they're probably shooting, or at least being shot at, by the corporate security.
I think the corporate security is something that could show up later. I think if we have that encounter run for 1 or 2 rounds, where the players actually are not completely aware of the threat, might make it interesting that they say, this is annoying, we want that guy off. But as the arm is described, shaking off is not an option. It's hard to get that person off. And then in the middle of trying to do something without really knowing what's happening, that, let's call it black van, shows up, because it's always a black van, right? And then you're like, oh, this just got worse without us any doing anything. I think that would bring that additional tension in there, where everybody gets a little bit more motivated.
And this could go with our failure ideas as well. Of we don't want the attention from the actual authorities, and so we want him to stop shooting, stop yelling, and if we fail in whatever we're doing, negotiating or trying to throw him off the car or whatever, then this causes the corporate security to come faster. There's this consequence that we don't know about, like you just said, Rolf. Blades in the Dark does this really well with their clock system, where there could be a clock that one clock is for, like, for example, one clock is the time it takes to get this guy off the car, get this guy to shut up, whatever. And then there's another that perhaps the players don't even know about, that's counting down of when the corporate security arrives.
Yeah. So then I think we already kind of are branching into the stakes. With the initial encounter, it's just this guy on the back of the car. If they can't get him to stop shooting and calm down, a complete failure looks like they have the police and this corporate security after them, right? A partial success could be that they know what's going on when the police and the security are coming after them, or that they know who the security is, or, that they have some information as this starts to happen. And then the full success would be he calms down. They have to figure out the next steps with this guy, but they're not dealing necessarily with corporate security right on their tails.
This is an immediate threat situation. Is basically what it is. So if they're trying to, the full success is that the immediate threat has been stopped.
What's the tension here? What's driving the characters forward to keep moving and to keep doing whatever it is they need to do?
Well, we can't stay here. There's a guy screaming on our car. No, I'm joking. But yeah, I mean, that's part of the tension, is that we have other goals. The characters have other goals that they are in the middle of. And this is a complication that we don't want, we don't need.
They have another job, right? Cool. So then what choices exist for the players that will impact the outcome? What are the approaches they could take, or what are the things they can interact with to impact how this encounter goes?
I mean, you have the standard, the talking, negotiating, calm down, get in the car. You have the straight up murder and move on. Like that is that's a choice that characters will sometimes make. And then you have, I feel like there's got to be a third choice of there's a social solution, there's a violent solution.
I think there should be a skill solution that might have some sort of impact, where we try to either loosen the hand or dismantle part of our vehicle so the guy falls off. Which would be interesting if we, for example, say he's attached to a door and we just kick the door off. When corporate catches up with that guy, they now have a door from our car, which might be a repercussion that later pops up out of nowhere, which would be a fun consequence as a GM to think about, and knowing that this might be an option. That might be something. When we say combat, I don't think killing would be the only option. I think overpowering just enough that the guy lets go or is incapacitated, and we have more control over getting him off the car should always be on the table. I think we often forget that combat doesn't necessarily have to end with death.
What language are you speaking, Rolf?
Yeah, I know. And some systems kind of suggest that 0 hit points doesn't necessarily mean somebody died. They're just incapacitated, and then we could think about what else it means. So we could have that option there as well. The non-lethal damage, or whatever we would want to call it.
If we were playing Shadowrun, you get 2 hit point tracks. It could be the stun track or the wound track, which depends on what game we're playing.
Very, very true. Very true.
There you go.
And in such a cyberpunk world, you could think that there would be characters that could do some sort of hacking to dismantle what is the word I'm looking for? Turn off the arm. Deactivate. That's the word I was looking for. There's some, that kind of thing.
And I'm sorry, Ralf, I didn't mean to derail your point.
No, that adds perfectly to the point. In something like Shadowrun, there's also enough drugs that we could just drug that guy, which is also something against their consent. So it's kind of a combat situation, I would say, even though it's not necessarily straight up combat. But yeah, there are multiple ways we could overpower this person, either based on skills or based on combat roles. I think all of them are interesting.
Yeah. And then finally, we can talk a little bit about what would the mechanics be that we would use to enforce these things. Would there be any special mechanics involved?
We said Shadowrun, so there's surely a completely specific mechanic for that robot arm somewhere in the book.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Well, for hacking the robot arm, there is a completely specific mechanic.
There's also a mechanic for if you're the face character talking to this person. There's a mechanic for everything. Don't worry.
There's specific mechanics for driving. Talking falls, I think, under the regular suite of skills. Although I will say, for all of the grief that I give it, the whole concept of always rolling a skill with a trait is a pretty cool idea. And actually, you can roll 2 traits as well. So you're always selecting 2 things, and you can do some interesting things with that. Some interesting interpretation.
Okay, to add some other mechanic in there, and that's general, not just in this situation. I like the Devil's Bargain idea that the GM can say, hey, I make this roll easy for you, but if you don't make it, something bad happens. And the players know, so they know, okay, I have a higher chance, but the failure or the consequence will look a little bit more dire. And I could even maybe tell them part of what might happen. I tend to be a player who is happy to take those bargains. So it's easy to sway me. Because, again, I think it's interesting when something like that happens. But that is a mechanic that is on top of the other stuff that makes it interesting to do failure.
I would enforce rounds in this situation. I think even though it doesn't start out as a combat situation, I would have a countdown, a clock. And when I say enforce rounds, I just mean, okay, we know in 2 minutes or in, 2 game turns, basically.
The time is being tracked in some way.
Exactly. So that it's like, I can't just keep talking to him until I get what I want. Like, okay, what are you trying to do? You get to say the thing you want to say to him, roll it, see if it works. You get to try and do this one hacking maneuver. You can try and hit him once or twice or whatever, but it's not just that infinite amount of however long you need it to be.
I would also make sure that the individual takes on shaking that guy off are tracked when it comes to the other player's action. For example, if the driver tries to shake him off with some maneuver and me as a combat-oriented character tries to lean out of the window, it's getting harder for me because there is a maneuver being added. So I would make sure that that kind of stuff is added onto it. Or if I have a weapon that is somewhat electricity-based and the hacker connects to that guy, to try to get the arm off. There are two connections. Again, this might have some repercussions for the hacker in our group if I hit that guy with my electric weapon. Stuff like that, I think, yes, it's a little bit more complicated, but that's something that also shows not everybody is just doing random stuff in a vacuum. Everything is kind of connected. And that situation, you have to think about those things and keep track of them.
In the same tailing on that, I would make communicating with each other what you're trying to do an action.
Sounds fair.
Because I think in this situation, what makes it interesting is random dude has grabbed onto your car. You don't have a lot of time before things escalate. What are you doing? You can talk about it, but that's a turn. That's everybody who wants to be involved in that situation who's not doing anything about it. That's your turn. Like, you get to say a thing where normally I wouldn't regulate stuff like that. I think in this particular encounter, to get the sort of sense of confusion and
immediacy,
hysteria that you're kind of, I think, going for, immediacy, you have just like, what do we do? Like, I think I would do that. Cool. So I think that's our encounter. Guy jumps onto your car. He's got a mechanical arm that he has stolen. Corporate security are coming. He's shooting wildly, and you are just trying to keep quiet. So then we'll do the box text section here in just a minute. The crew is sitting quietly in the car, heading towards the job. It should be easy enough, but still dangerous if anything goes wrong. Everyone is engaged in the preparation rituals. The driver focused on the road, your combatants cleaning their weapons, and your hacker flicking back and forth between different programs, making sure they work. This sort of quiet contemplation comes before everyone's job. Far from a sign of anxiety, it means you're focused. Thud interrupts your thoughts as something lands on the back of your car, shattering the windshield and tearing apart the metal of the car. Just what you didn't need, more heat and attention. A man, pink mohawk, shirtless with a poorly drawn dragon tattoo and cybernetic arm which seems to be stuck in the car, has hitched a ride. "Don't worry, chumps, just keep driving," he orders you in an obnoxious voice. What do you do? Thanks for listening to the Encounter Table. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to the podcast, leave us a 5-star rating and review on Apple or your favorite podcatcher, and share us with your friends. We love to hear from our listeners, so please comment on the podcast on our website at www.tabletop-rpg-encounters.com. Find us on Twitter at TTRPGEncounters or on Facebook at the Tabletop RPG Encounters page. If you'd like to support the podcast in a monetary way, you can visit our Patreon at www.patreon.com/the_encounter_table. If you want to buy any of the games we discuss, use our affiliate links in the podcast description or the affiliate links on our websites. This helps us find cool stuff to review and talk about. The music accompanying our box text is Flashing Runner by Blue Dot Sessions. You can find their music at sessions.blue. You can find Ralf on Twitter at WooDaRPG, that's at WUDERPG, or buy some of his games at woodarpg.itch.io. Kade is a real person you can't find on the internet. And remember, keep playing,
keep designing,
and always check for traps.